Of course, those were the sounds of Peter Gabriel live at the Nelson Mandela's 70th birthday at Wembley in 1988. Today is celebrating 100 years since the birth of the struggle icon Nelson Mandela. And joining us now via Skype from London is Tony Hollingsworth, who is an organizer and producer of two Nelson Mandela Global tribute concerts that were broadcast in 1988 and also 1990. Tony, thanks so much for your time. I mean, why did you take it upon yourself to put together these tribute concerts, and especially at a time when Nelson Mandela was actually viewed as a terrorist in many parts of the world?
Well, I'd been promoting a number of African artists in London, including Miriam Makeba and Abdullah Ibrahim, so I was very aware of the situation of apartheid in South Africa. But I'd also become very aware that 50% of the world's news reported Mandela as a black terrorist leader. That was in 1987. And so I went to see a gentleman called Archbishop Trevor Huddleston, who was the chairman of the anti-apartheid movement in Britain. We had the largest civil society anti-apartheid movement in Britain, really because we had a government supporting apartheid more than anyone else in a rather embarrassing bit of history. But I went to see Trevor and said, I think I've thought of a way of stopping the world's radio and television news reporting Mandela as a black terrorist leader. If the campaign works, they'll just call him a black leader. And he said, what is it you're planning? And I said, it's a musical tribute to the man on his birthday, and it will just be music. And he said, and why would it just be music? And I said, because if we make it about calling for sanctions, or if we make it for the release of all political prisoners, the broadcasters can't take it by way of their own license conditions. They're not allowed to do political events. But if we make it a musical tribute for the man, then they can take it. Then I can persuade the entertainment divisions of the broadcasters to take it, and I know what will happen a few months after they've signed the contract. They will go home, having signed the contract, watch their television, watch their news on their channel. Remember, we didn't have so many channels then, and realize that their news on their channel was still reporting him a terrorist. And the head of the entertainment division, having signed a contract for us for an 11.5-hour tribute to Nelson Mandela, would then have to persuade his news division to drop the word terrorist. He would be contracted to us to an 11.5-hour tribute, and the news division wouldn't be contracted to anyone to keep using the word terrorist, so they'd have to drop it. Otherwise, the station would look foolish with the entertainment side celebrating Mandela and the news side calling him a terrorist. So in the run-up to those events, we actually cleared up most of the broadcasters around the world, about 100 of them, television and radio news, who then stopped calling him a terrorist, and in the run-up to it, started calling him a black thief.
And a victory from the broadcast point of view, but what was the British government's stance on the concert that, as you rightly said, was more than just a musical concert? It was a political message there as well. What was their stance to it back then, especially given the fact that we know that there were many corners that actually supported the apartheid regime?
Well, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. And she, until much later than our events, and in fact beyond even Mandela's release, still called him a terrorist. So she was the Prime Minister and she was against it. But it was her party, the Conservative Party, that were taking action to try and stop the BBC in this country broadcasting it. And the BBC weren't making it, they were a broadcaster, but the Conservative Party were trying to take them to court for breaking their constitution. Their constitution said they couldn't cover political events, but the contract that I'd given the BBC said that it was going to be wall-to-wall music. It didn't say it would be politics. So they had a legal protection. Now, of course, it was a live event, and of course it called for Mandela's release, and it called, of course, for sanctions and everything else. But in the run-up to it, before it had happened, in law, the contract looked as though it was just music.
And I mean, so this was the concert in 1988. You went on and did another concert in 1990. What inspired the second one?
Well, in fact, it was Nelson Mandela that inspired the second one. he had seen the first one on videos that were smuggled in to his prison accommodation. And as he was started negotiating his release from prison, he sent his lawyer, one of the ones at the time, Ismail Ayoub, to see me in London to say, would I produce a second global broadcast event? Now, the first one had got to 600 million people in 100 countries, and they were saying, could you produce a second one as big as that for as soon after he was released as possible? So I said, do you know when he's being released? And they said, no. And I said, well, that makes it rather difficult, but we can have a go. But please tell me what the communications point is. I mean, of course we want to celebrate his release, but there must be something else going on behind this. And the answer was yes. Both Mandela and the ANC are worried that when he walks free, now that he is so much of an icon, that when he walks free, that the world will then confuse that with being the end of apartheid and take political pressure off and take sanctions off, and that what we'll then get is sort of apartheid light. He wanted a global platform, another global broadcast event, to be able to say to the world, thank you, but keep the pressure up, keep the sanctions up until we get to free elections. And so that's what we did. And in fact, 54 days after he was released, so I had 54 days from the sort of shotgun going off, we had another broadcast to approximately the same sort of size, number of broadcasters, 100, but an audience of 500 million people watching.
Wow, Tony, I want to continue to talk to you more about Mandela and everything that you've done towards that legacy. But before that, here is more from Nelson Mandela at the second international concert that Tony was talking about, of course, to free South Africa in 1990.
Master of Ceremonies. Dear friends here and elsewhere in the world, thank you. Thank you that you chose to care.
Wow, thank you that you chose to care was the message that he has delivered to 500 million people, as we've just heard from Tony. But Tony, I'd like to bring you back and just find out, I mean, meeting the man, what was he like to you? How did that come about? And also, how are you remembering him today when he would have been 100 years old?
Well, when I first met him, it was very much meeting a producer of a show, meeting somebody that was going to, talk in that show, and it was about practicalities. It was about, had he used microphones in this way before, because he'd been in prison for so long? Had he had enough experience in front of cameras? Could we actually sort of work on his speech and time his speech? So it was a very practical meeting. We had no time. He'd been flown in. We had a few days before the show. He had lots of political meetings to take. So it was a very practical meeting. But he was, people won't think this is possible now, but he was a little nervous. And then there was then we arranged things that with the fear of the British security forces at the time was that when Mandela went on stage to an audience of 500 million people would be the ideal time for some sharpshooter to try and kill him. So we had to work with the security forces in Britain to clean the stadium and make sure it was very, very secure and have a place where Mandela could be secure during the daytime before he went on stage where he could meet lots and lots of people. And so we had a place arranged and there was an arrangement made with the MI5 that at the particular point in time when I thought it was right to put him on stage, which wouldn't be pre-planned, so nobody could get themselves in position to shoot him, that at that point in time I would then clear it with the security forces, and if they also felt it was safe, I would go and get him and Trevor, who was going to introduce him. and put them on stage. And I went to get him, and we went into this secure room. And as I went up to these two old gentlemen with all of their entourage, I said, now I say this to all artists before I put them on the stage, would you like to go to the toilet? Because if you see that audience, you probably will. And they both said no. But as we went down the stairs, started going down the stairs to go towards the stage, Mandela said, yes, I would rather like to go. So he and I walked around the corner to where the toilet was. And when we came back, everyone else had left, and the security forces had left, and they'd locked us in. The producer of the show and the main star were locked in, and the security entourage used to be making sure that everyone else was locked in. It took us rather a long time to work out how to get out of there and onto stage. And when we got onto stage, the security forces were all looking out at the audience, and none had realized that we'd even disappeared. But there you are. They had actually locked us in rather than secured us.
Wow, Tony, thank you for sharing.
I was flustered. I was flustered. He was not.
I can imagine, as a producer of a show where 500 million people were in attendance, I can imagine the flustered. But Tony, thanks so much for sharing your memories with us. Thanks to Tony Hollingsworth, organizer and producer of two Nelson Mandela Global Tribute Concerts that were broadcast in 1988 and also 1990.